Hello, Garland Nixon here. We're hanging out with Peter Erickson. We're going to talk about what's happening, some very, very strange situation going on in Europe. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and well, hanging out with Peter Erickson. Peter has a great channel. It's called Conversation Amongst the Ruins. He and his son Charlie on, I think, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, and then they release stuff and different cuts over the course of the week. So check it out. It's a great channel. Very, very interesting. You'll learn a lot of stuff. All right, Peter, let's get started. You know, it's kind of interesting. The phenomenon in Europe that they're facing an economic collapse at home. They're facing disaster, and of course, an subsequent, an economic collapse would, subsequently, end up with a political collapse, potentially, societal issues, a lot of problems. But we have in Macron, in Starmer, and in Merz people whose only concern is foreign policy, and in particular, Ukraine. Now they'll stop and they'll bark at, whatever, something about Israel or Iran every now and then, or maybe something about China or something, whatever the U.S. wants. Yeah, the U.S.'s adversaries are their adversaries. But the fact of the matter is they have completely abandoned their home countries. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I don't think you're exaggerating at all. I mean, it's really quite an extraordinary phenomenon. You were talking about probably the three most important countries in Europe, in Western Europe. And yeah, you would think that these countries would produce some kind of political talent, that the electoral process, which is supposed to be in some way free, and would produce people that were actually devoted to the interests of the people who elected them. But we just don't see it. It's just, again, you're not exaggerating at all. And there are a lot of grumblings. I think there should be a lot more than grumbling in these countries. I think they should be out in the streets. I really don't understand how apathetic Europeans have become. They need to, that's part of the reason that these people get away with it, is that there aren't enough people out in the streets. There's the occasional demonstration, but that's about it. How can we understand this? I think part of it is there is always this temptation to, towards military conquests or exploits on the part of a president, a leader of a country. Stop and think about it. And usually when there's a statue built to a president or something, he's usually, a war president. It's just a fact. And you don't ever see a statue built to the guy who got that housing bill through or something. Maybe you should, but that seems to be, those are the ones that are held up as heroes. And I think that each of them wants to be a Winston Churchill, I think that's how they look at it in their mind. And there's that temptation towards greatness. But these are not great men. I'm sorry. They're just not, they shouldn't even be trying. And then there's just the general messiness and kind of really the intractable nature of a lot of these domestic problems. The thing is, you can often, it's going to be hard. You've got a lot of conflicting interests. If I cut taxes, well, then I've also got to cut social programs. And that's going to make people, a certain sector of society angry. There's just no way. There's give and take. Somebody wins, somebody loses within the country. If you do it, and it takes a lot of negotiations. You got to work with the trade unions, and everybody's got to have a piece of the pie. Everybody's got to have a say. It's hard. You have to be a very talented politician, with a real loyal following to get through any meaningful domestic legislation. And I think they look at it and they say, I'm never going to solve this mess. The problems are getting larger and larger. The greater the problems become, of course, they should be trying to do what they can. But I think their reaction is they look at it and they say, I think I'll go to Ukraine, or I think I'll go, to Kiev and shake hands with or hug Zelensky, or I'm going to go to Paris and, hang out with my buddies and we'll discuss big and important things. This is our great plan for saving Ukraine, or, that's, I think that's what we're looking at least on one level.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's the local level of how the politician deals with the issues or runs from the issues in his respective country. There's another issue that I want to run by you. Okay, we have people use terms like neoliberalism and globalism and things like that. And this, part of that discussion is a lack of sovereignty where these unelected international bodies, be it, the TPP or the NAFTA or something, or some elected body, tends to take to relieve the citizens of a given country of their sovereignty, right? But by the same token, the EU, as an example, unelected body, kind of there's no sovereignty in Europe kind of with the EU. They're telling you can do this in that country and you can do that in this country, but nobody elected us to tell you that. You didn't elect us to do that, right? And so the concept of globalism being that from this angle, Macron doesn't work for the French. He works for the international, the banking cartels, finance capital. He comes from, what is it? He worked for the Rothschild Bank. He worked for Goldman Sachs. So, international finance capital or whatever particular group that controls this person or these people, so that these power groups can say, we can get this guy in this country. We'll get our guy over in that country. We'll get a guy over in that country. So really, you do not represent your constituents are not in your country. Your constituents are like international finance capital, and international finance capital is saying, look, we need to take over Russia. They got a lot of resources and we need those resources, and screw your country. They're going to fall apart anyway. We're not interested in that. They got gas and all kinds of things in Russia. So let's focus on that. So that is the issue of sovereignty and the true constituency, the implied constituency of these particular leaders. What about that angle?
Yeah, well, I think you pointed out that Macron has that background in banking, international finance. You look at Merz; he was the BlackRock candidate, right? He was the CEO of BlackRock Germany. Very similar. Again, we're talking about international finance. So yeah, these people are true globalists. I think there's no question about it. So they just don't. I guess, part of being a globalist is that you almost think it beneath you to be too concerned about the people on your one little piece of the world. It's just that you look at the world and it's just one big, chessboard, and you want to put your piece there or whatever. And it's just like, all these people are pestering me about taxes or, their pensions, just get out of here. I have important things to do here. I think there is something to that, just those are the circles that these people have moved in for decades, and they just don't even have a connection with the people below them. And their connection is with, that's where they want to be. That's, so that's why, Starmer, instead of, even as his government is falling apart, he flies off to Paris, or Merz flies off to Kiev. When, they have serious problems, very unpopular, but it seems like they don't even care. It's just like, this is, I want to be there, playing the big game, the things that really matter, to my associates and whatever. I think that's another aspect of it.
Even the corporation, if you have a corporation like the old corporations before the international monopolies, right? If you're not talking about international finance, if I've got a corporation and that corporation is in the United States, or let's say in Germany, corporation in Germany, I have some stake in Germany. I want to see Germany be a solid company. I got some stakes in seeing the company, the country that I reside in, that my company works off of, that we're headquartered in. I want some stability in that country. So even the rich people that own corporations have some stake in the given country that they're from.
Right.
Nowadays, if I get a country and that's worth $1 billion, a couple billion, I move my headquarters to like the Isle of Man or Cyprus or one of these islands, Caribbean island or something, where I can hide my money. I'm doing business all over the world. I got Kentucky Fried Chickens in China, and I got them in Pakistan. I don't have a home country anymore that I have a stake in seeing stability there. So what do I really care? That country can fall apart. The country that's my foundational country is no longer my foundational country. So the mindset even of the business people isn't as locked in as having a stake and having stability in their quote home country as it would be before this kind of globalist thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and we can see it too in like the career trajectories of a lot of these European leaders. For example, Ursula von der Leyen. She was previously, if I remember correctly, a defense minister in Germany. Supposed to be the worst defense minister of all time. So what happens? She gets booted upstairs, and she's head of the East, the EU, and then Annalena Baerbock, famous 360 Baerbock, Annalena. She's now, what's her position at the UN? It's something like it's very high, like essentially high. Like the Speaker of the Assembly or something like that. Quite extraordinary. Yeah, right.
From
there
this
you go.
Little country, and you listen to these people, and they're not intellectuals by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I'm being charitable here.
Right, you're being very charitable. So I mean, it's just like each one of these people, I think they're all the same. And I've heard talk, I think like Macron, maybe he's eyeing the EU or the UN, or maybe he'll just go back into international finance. And I'm sure it's the same with Merz. This is something just sort of it's just a stop on their career paths, right? We'll just do a little something, whether it's Estonia or Germany or France or whatever. But for them, it's the world, is theirs, and it's their playground. There's no real long-term commitment. There's no real roots. I think we see that in all these people.
And there's no foundation in reality. I mean, they're still having meetings now. Clearly, Russia has demonstrated through military power that they can project force on their border, their strategic border. They're saying, hey, this is our strategic border. You can't come in. The NATO says, yes, we can. And Russia says, okay, we'll have to settle this. And Russia utilized, when it comes down to it, the physical power to demonstrate. And this is, you can like it or not, but this is the history of humankind. This has happened time and time again, where two countries, and one country says, no, that little sliver of land is mine. The other country says, no, we'll do whatever we want. They fight it out, and the one country limps away and says, okay, you're the alpha male, and whatever, like two wolves. One of them challenges the other wolf.
Right.
Boom, he bites him a couple times. All right, you're leading the pack. That's the way it goes. That's reality. The Mark Rutte, or whoever his name is, the other day, they were talking to him about this whole saying, yes, well, Russia says you can't put troops in Ukraine. And he was like, Russia doesn't get a say in this. Come on, who are they? Russia? We put troops where we want to. Putin might as well be the governor of Texas. Who doesn't he think? Yeah. There's not a foothold on reality that says in the kinetic world, in the world of physics, you have to face what has physically happened. You can say they don't. It sounds great. We are not amused. Sounds good.
Right.
Until you get punched in the face. If you try it, you're going to get knocked out. You can say they don't get a say, and you can say, okay, we're going in. And Russia said, well, you put your troops in there, we're going to blow them to pieces. No, you won't. We know how that story's going to end if they do it.
Yeah. No, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, this complete really lack of any sort of grip on reality. And I think, again, we have to contrast it with the Cold War days, the days of the Soviet Union, because I remember well, it was the Soviet Union was hated by a lot of people, but it was also respected. It was feared. And there was some always, within certain segments of the population, real admiration. All of those things were there. But even among those who hated the Soviet Union, they feared it too. They respected it. And something happened, in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. And then, the Russia, which was the inheritor of the Soviet Union, you can say, of that great power mantle, was really flat on its back and just could not get up to continue the fight or the struggle. And, all these lesser powers took advantage. It took them a little while to realize what was going on, but then just sort of gleefully, they got up and started dancing around, the fallen giant. And they just don't seem to have understood that the giant has actually got up, shook himself off, and is now, starting to pummel them, and demonstrating that, yeah, he is once again, the great power of Europe. But they just they will not acknowledge that reality. It just seems like they just will not do it. Maybe they're just incapable of doing it. It just is something that, to them, it's a nightmare. It's like they're having a bad dream. And they want to wake up from it. It's just like they're trying to pinch themselves. It must be that, we just haven't tried hard enough. We just have to exert our will a little bit more, and then Russia will fall. Because we know Russia's weak. We just know it. We know it. And, we just got to push them one more time. We got to say a few brave more words, and then they'll just, they'll come begging, crawling to us. It sounds so ridiculous, but hey, this is the policy that they're pursuing. This is the rhetoric that they're using. And it's, it is like easily, 15, 20 years out of date. But here they are, these are people that should know better, but they don't.
What's interesting is this, and that's not the only arena, because they've got two ends here. One side of it is Russia has to do what we tell them to do. And you ignore the past. You ignore the Minsk Accords. You ignore the fact that you violated the Minsk Accords. You ignore any possibility, anything that you may have done that may have contributed to this. Nope. You invent a new narrative. Well, Russia just woke up one day and attacked Ukraine. You ignore everything about Ukraine. And Ukraine's the good guys. You ignore all the bad, very highly questionable things about Ukraine. Ignore everything. And then you say, okay, we'll put troops in, and America will give us a backstop. And they say, Trump, how about a backstop? He says, nope. Oh, okay. Well, we need to get up together with a plan. Let's have a meeting in Paris. Great. What do you say? I say we put together troops and go to Ukraine, and Trump gives us a backstop. How about that backstop, Trump? Nah. Oh, okay. We need to come up with a better plan then. We got the perfect one. We're going to go to Trump, and then we'll convince him to do the backstop, and then we'll put troops in Ukraine. And they just repeat the same thing over and over. And history tells us the United States uses proxies, and with an emphasis on the word uses proxies. They never back them up. They never die for them. I'm not going to say it ain't going to happen this time, but I'm saying it's never, ever, ever, ever happened before. The safe bet is consistency. But they just, the amazing thing is to watch someone as the world, it's like the front lines are crumbling, and you'll hear Macron is panicking because the front lines are crumbling. Who didn't see this coming? But you know what? They're now, last I heard they were going to meet in Sweden. I wonder what kind of plan they're going to cut together and come up with a plan. I wonder what it'll be. I have a feeling we already know, don't you?
Right. There's definitely a lack of imagination here. That's right. We've been hearing this all along. And I think for about 3 years, we've been hearing that, there's the, of course, the troops on the grounds, which we sometimes call them ceasefire troops. Sometimes they're reassurance. That sounds like such a silly euphemism, something like, I don't know, comfort woman or something.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why I thought of that, but but it's, this has been going on for a long time. And then there's always the argument that's made that we got us. Okay, we have our plan to send troops, and we'll keep on sending weapons to Ukraine, and we'll give them more money so that they can strengthen their bargaining position at the table. You say, well, okay, wait a second. You've been saying this for 3 years. You've been giving them weapons for 3 years. You've been, pouring billions of dollars into Ukraine for, better than 3 years. And with the stated objective of improving their bargaining position at the table. And throughout the 3 years, ever since the fall of 2022, let's say, that's really kind of the high tide for Ukraine after the launch of the SMO. It's gotten worse. Every month it gets worse. And you keep on saying the same thing. Don't you notice this? Don't you think Ukraine is? So at what point is it, where do you have the plan where this starts getting better? It's just always, I know we have a brilliant plan. We'll give them more money. We're going to send them more weapons, and and we'll have our troops ready to send there, to reassure them or whatever.
We're going to strike. I like this one. We must strike deeper into Russia so that Russia can feel pain, and it always works like this. And then we'll drive Russia to the bargaining table. Well, wait a minute. Russia keeps saying we're perfectly willing to come to the bargaining table. Well, if we strike Russia with deeper weapons, then we'll force them to the bargaining table. They're at the bargaining table waiting for you. They're sitting at the bargaining table saying, guys, we're waiting for you at the bargaining table. We must strike them and force them to the bargaining table. It even doesn't even make any sense. Russia's like, well, we're perfectly willing to talk to you. We'll talk to the Zelensky can come to Moscow. No way. I'm never coming to Moscow. I'll talk to the Europeans. Absolutely not. He's an evil guy. But we've got to force him to the bargaining table by striking deeper into Russia with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy on so many levels. Again, it shows just an inability to recognize the world as it is, the new world order that we live in, the multipolar world. They're still living in the 90s. I don't think they could do that in the 90s even, send missiles deep. And, it's just that, look, these are sovereign countries, with a sense of their, that have their own histories, and, they have a sense of their own dignity. And you don't simply subjugate them. You cannot do that. This is really, just an old imperial mindset that we can just beat them to a bloody pulp, and then, and then he'll come crawling over to us. Well, maybe you can do that to a country that's much weaker than you are, and you could beat that poor country to a bloody pulp, and you can get it to do what you want to do. But look, Russia is a great power, just like, India and China and whatever, but you're still using, wake up to the world that you live in. You just can't do this. It's just, you may not like Russia. You may think that that launching the SMO was very wrong, but Russia is a great power, and and they have demonstrated that, especially over the last couple of years. And you've thrown everything. It hasn't worked. Maybe you should stop, and instead of going back and repeating the same old mantras, maybe exercise your imagination, open your eyes. Look at the new world that's out there, and start dealing with it.
It seems to me that Europe, they claimed the Enlightenment period and all that kind of stuff, right? You want to talk about the Dark Ages? You know what I mean? Believing things as a matter of faith. Mm-hmm. That was, a staple, a pillar of the Dark Ages. Knowledge was revealed to you by God. It was revealed, and since it was revealed, you couldn't possibly challenge knowledge because we knew it was true because God had said it, or the priest said it, or the king, or whoever said it. And you don't challenge what the power structures say is true, even if you do some scientific investigation and you find out it isn't true, you're going to get burned at the stake if you say otherwise. So you don't do it. Okay. And it seems to return to the Dark Ages. If someone says, your position on the Russians, I'd like to discuss it. I have an alternative perspective that's different than yours. Oh, you love Putin. You're a Putin apologist. In other words, no, you're not allowed to question things out. This is the way it is. Mm-hmm. We all believe this. And if you argue that things could be anything other than the way we believe there be, and we argue that there be, you will be attacked. You could face jail time, thrown off the internet. Terrible things can happen. So my point is, it seems as though Europe has returned to the Dark Ages, or perhaps they never left. Perhaps it's simply that the ruling elite was never challenged in the way that they are. And as soon as they are properly challenged, they will simply return. Their darkness, the darkness in the ruling elite of the Europeans is exposed.
Yeah, no, there's clearly just been a collective loss of rationality. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. It's not just that, okay, yeah, this is the way we think, and that's it. It's like, if you bring up something that their own statements from, let's say, prior to the launch of the SMO, I know that Professor Glenn Deason often points this out, because he'll do this. He said, wait a second, like just in 2019, we're pointing to the neo-Nazi problem in Ukraine. And we had articles in the New York Times and other mainstream media. I think there was even the European Commission actually came down hard on it was the Svoboda Party when it was founded. Yeah. Right. Yeah, all of these things, this is not stuff that I'm making up. This is what you said. This says, no, it's like, get away from me, Satan. It's like, you can't say this. So yeah, it is quite bizarre. It's just like they have quickly agreed what is true and what isn't. And it's everything, even statements that they themselves made, just a few years ago, that can't be brought up anymore. You're a very, very bad person if you bring this up. Yeah. How do we explain this? I don't know. It's I would have to say that I don't think it's always been this way. I know it hasn't, because let's go back to, for example, the Iraq War. Europe wasn't always subordinate to the U.S. in the way that it is now. They weren't always vassals. Okay, maybe they were semi-vassals or something, but there was a certain amount of independence. And as we recall, for example, the French strongly opposed our invasion of Iraq, back in 2003. And so there was all that nonsense about freedom fries and all that, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, or I remember a lot of silliness from that time. But the French weren't the only. I believe the Germans did. And then earlier, like the Germans did actually pursue, against American wishes, would pursue an independent course. They established friendly relations with the Soviet Union, friendlier than what the Americans actually wanted them to do. And then even as recently as Merkel, Angela Merkel, she was opposed to initially to Ukraine's accession to NATO, and argued against
Nord
it.
Stream 2.
Right, exactly. And she actually brought it to a conclusion, against a lot of pressure and all kinds of efforts to sabotage it. Back then, not literally, we know how it ended, but there were all kinds of efforts to, sanction the companies that were involved and so on and so forth. But she brought it through. There was a spark of independence and rationality and concern for the interests of the Europeans themselves. And you just don't see that anymore. It's just all gone. It's like, who are these new people that are here? They don't seem to even remember. Like you almost start to wonder whether, that they're lizard people or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. Of course I'm joking, but it just.
Yeah, but I know what you're saying.
Right.
Here's an example of what we're talking about. I brought this up many times. Okay. The Rand Corporation, right? That wrote this document in 2019, and many of us have pointed to it, saying in this document they told you they were going to overextend and unbalance Russia, and they talked about how they could use Ukraine, and it was clearly malevolent policies towards Russia, right? And but after the special military operation started, there were many of us opening it up saying, read this. How are they going to say that they were completely innocent and they weren't acting in a manner to hurt Russia when they wrote a document that said they wanted to hurt Russia, right? You go down a little bit and it says, now look at this. We encourage you to explore this research brief in the full report that it's based on. Listen to this. However, because Russian state media entities and individuals sympathetic to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, sympathetic to it, as opposed to people who have a different perspective. But anyway, have mischaracterized this research in recent weeks. How have we mischaracterized it? We pointed to it and said, read this. In recent weeks, we also encourage you to explore this helpful resource on Russia Hood's Fire Hose of Falsehood, Approach to Propaganda, and our research on truth decay, which is a phenomenon that is driven in part by the spread of disinformation. They have said nothing. The research on truth decay and fire hose of falsehood, it sounds like childish things. Yeah. Truth decay? They've done research on truth decay. And what we found out through people like various people like Matt Taibbi and other people, that they spent a fortune creating all of these organizations that were supposed to do like misinformation and disinformation research, and it was a scam, and it was a fraud, and they were filling their pockets, and they were just lying through their teeth, making up things. So that's the other side of it. There's clearly a malevolence here. It would be one thing if they didn't know they were lying. But when we see them coming up with organizations intentionally lying, it's like we can see, we actually see behind the curtain.
Yeah, no, there clearly is just a very deep-seated hatred, a visceral hatred of Russia and all things Russian, and people say it goes all the way back to the Cold War or before, all the way back to the Crimean War, and some people argue even earlier, in the case of Great Britain. But it's there. Yeah, there is a hatred. There's a real malevolence that has shaped this campaign against Russia. Well before the launch of the SMO, and you can very easily argue that it really led to the launch of the SMO. And it's something that Charlie and I talk about. But I find it difficult, when you're talking about people's real interests, rational people, they can be good or evil or whatever. But if they're rational, you say, well, I understand what he's about. He's just trying to steal this oil or whatever. Right. Or he just wants those resources, or this country, this ruling elite, wants to seize control of these resources. That's in their interests as they perceive it, and so on. But when you talk about these irrational, because they really are irrational hatreds, it's really, I find that it resists analysis. It's just have to admit that it's just there. And you can point to certain historical causes and whatever, but in the end, just like where you run into a person like that who's just full of hate for some other person. Maybe it had you can point to some incident, but it's not sufficient to explain this person's hatred. This person is obviously unbalanced, and that's what I feel about the ruling elite in the West right now.
Well, you hear the the French Revolution. You hear the let 'em eat cake things. You hear these historical incidences of people in Europe, European ruling elite, who clearly, were walking right into a guillotine. And you look at it and you're like, you couldn't see that the people were starving. And you were just like, I think I'll build another castle. The people are starving. I think I'll build an even more castle, and I'll make this one more ornate. That there's a history in Europe, particularly in France, I might add, of ignoring the plight of the working class. And I dare to say, and I've said this for a while, if they continue on the course that they are on, I suspect there will be some level of violence from the people at some point. It's like, if I continue to say, I'll put it like this: I smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and I drank a quart of whiskey every day, and I eat 10 cheeseburgers. I live off cheeseburgers and fries and whiskey and cigarettes day and night, right? And people say, Garland, maybe you should do something, exercise a little bit, maybe change your diet, a little bit of water, perhaps a vegetable occasionally. Nah, this is good for me. This is what's going to make me healthy. You don't know anything, right? All that exercise, walking around and doing stretching and things like that, that's what's going to kill you. It sounds good. One of these days, I'm going to wake up, if I'm lucky, I'll wake up in a hospital after a stroke and a heart attack and everything else. I can tell everybody that that's good for me, but at some time, reality asserts itself. And it seems like that's the course they're on, that they're just going to be, we're going to continue to say everything we want. And you're like, the red lights are flashing all over your economy. And they're like, Sounds like Russian propaganda. Look, we've got to meet and talk about Putin right now. No time for these trivialities, right?
Right.
And you just feel like, when and how does this manifest itself so that the results of your deeds get to a point where you're staring them in the face and you can no longer say, who cares about this stuff? All is well. That's Russian propaganda.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think we're not too far away. The chickens will come home to roost. One thing we can see the real world consequences, or we saw it in the SCO meeting in Tianjin, and with the declaration, the signing of the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. That actually, the gas fields that are going to be tapped to send that gas to China, those are in northwestern Siberia. They're actually closer to Europe. And the original intent was to send that cheap gas, like a quarter of the price of the LNG that Europe is getting from the US, right into Europe, just to power, for German industry and in general, just to boost the prosperity of Europe. That's gone. They blew up their own pipeline. You stop and think about it, just so crazy, the whole thing. And now it's going to China. They've inked the deal, and you're just never going to see that again. We're talking about, this is, a long-term permanent, or about as permanent as anything in human history can be. It's, that's going to have repercussions for a century. You've been deprived of that, and the Chinese and East Asian in general will benefit from that, and that's your foolish choice. So there are real world consequences, and we're seeing them already, like the beginnings of them. Just the economic jitters, problems in the bond markets, slowing economies, an economy in recession in Germany, I think now for the third year in a row. That was supposed to be the powerhouse of the Europeans. Now it's always hard to make predictions on when a collapse is going to occur, but yeah, there are real world consequences. Cutting yourself off from trade, cutting yourself off from energy supplies, losing all those investment opportunities that they had in Russia. I think the Europeans themselves said that they lost $100 billion. The Russians say, I think Dmitriev, who is kind of Steve Witkoff's counterpart, says it's 300 billion. That's just one piece of it. That's a very small piece. We're talking about that, but all of those things add up, and you have Europe is not rich in natural resources the way that the U.S. is, for example. They just don't have. They don't have the energy. They need it. They need cheap energy. They need to be looking for the best on the market, and they have deprived themselves of it. It's just a refusal to recognize just really basic economic realities. So yeah, that all of those, again, the chickens will come home to roost. And it's always very difficult to predict the time, but the exact nature of a recession or even more so a collapse, or the timing of it. I think above all is the timing is very hard to predict, but we certainly are seeing signs. That's the alarm bells are beginning to ring, and hopefully, this is something that, again, that Charlie and I have talked about. It's like maybe the best thing we can hope for is just an economic collapse in Europe and the US, and that just maybe sober themselves up and just also just make it crystal clear they don't have any euros or dollars to play with. So I'm sorry, we just forget the whole Ukraine project, and let's just try to dig ourselves out of this hole. That's, I think, the best we can hope for.
Yeah, I think you're maybe looking at a circumstance where the people start to rise up, and start to say, hey, whoa, 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 things are real bad here. And they said, we ain't talking. And what would happen also is these governments, because their parliamentary systems, a number of them would collapse. A lot of things, I think a number of those governments, Starmer, et cetera, Macron, these people, their governments are on the border of collapse right now, and they're just ignoring it. There's another piece of this puzzle that I think is, at some point, it's going to cause a lot of problem for the ruling elite. And I say this: Gaza. You know, there was recently one of these film festivals, Cannes, I don't know, whatever, this film festival. And so there was this movie about Hind Rajab, you know, this young 5-year-old girl who they machine gunned her whole family and her and all this kind of stuff. Apparently there wasn't a dry eye in the house, and they got a 20-some minute standing ovation. And you're starting to see the fringes of those aren't the ruling elite. But, you know, when you talk about the artists in Hollywood, they are the people who are expected to do the dirty work. They put out the movies for the ruling elite. They put out the propaganda for the ruling elite. That's their job, and they're very well rewarded for it. And they're starting to lose them. I would say two things, two groups that I fear. One of them not so much for, and that is the ruling elite. They're the, let's just say this, the political elite in the US and other places are going to pay a price for this. I don't know what's going to happen when and if the midterms ever get here, but in the what do you call it, primaries, I don't know what's going to happen, because some of these people will get knocked out. Some young people who's going to be anti Zionism are going to run and knock some of these people out. So but also I fear, let me say this, the damage to worldwide Judaism. Because, you know, I look at my chat, I look at the chats of other shows, and I see people who, it's not just Zionism anymore, people who are becoming very anti-Semitic. The level of anti-Semitism that I saw in the past, the people that are blaming the Jews, everything for the Jews. And what we have, other issue we have is there are a lot of Jewish people here in America who are supporting Israel. And maybe they're more, some drifting away, but there's a huge amount. And so what's happening, I think, is, my point being this, I'm gonna leave this with you, throw this at you. The damage to the political elite and the damage to Judaism, at least in this country, is incalculable at this point. And it's going to explode. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
and I know that's a testy thing to say, but I mean, well, let's be realistic.
Right. No, I agree. I think that this is, you know, the harm that this has done, well, first of all, to Israel and its reputation is irreversible. They're just never going to recover reputationally from this. It's just, it's not going to happen. But it extends to the United States and then to the political class in general in the West, because it's just, everybody can see that they're complicit. Now, recently there's been a degree of nervousness, and, you know, we've got a few governments, you know, including Macron himself, said that he's going to recognize the state of Palestine. But it's, you know, I think it's meaningless. If you don't back it up with anything substantive, it just doesn't amount to anything. It's too little, too late. It's just, but it is a recognition that they're starting to feel the pressure on, you know, maybe it's just on the edges of, you know, you mentioned the film festival, but other things like that, those are significant. It's something that they notice, and they begin to, you know, they have friends of friends or something that are maybe a part of that, and they begin to just, it sort of enters their world, and they understand that there is something they need to address there. But they're still very firmly committed to Zionism. They have enabled, you know, especially the Americans, have enabled this genocide and continue to enable it, and the world sees it, and so the consequences, again, the harm that's done to their reputation, you know, any pretense they had to being, you know, to being moral and having some sort of right to lecture anybody else in the world, you know, that has suffered irreversible harm. I don't think they're ever going to recover from it. Then, as you know, as for the Jews in general, yeah, that is something to worry about. I would be very worried about it if I were a Jew, and clearly some of them are, and are making it crystal clear to everybody and loudly, you know, stating loudly, I have nothing to do with this. I condemn this. And some of the very best work that is being done, you know, against genocide is being done by Jews such as, you know, Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate. You know, I think we all know the names. That these people are just doing stellar work. But the thing is, you know, they were a really small minority, but they're not such a small minority anymore. There are more and more Jews, including Israeli Jews. You know, they're still a minority. Let's be honest, and especially in Israel, a very small minority, but it is a growing one. and they are saying, not in my name. I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is a genocide, unequivocally. We're seeing that happen. Now, the problem is on the other side, we have the Zionist Jews who very much want to conflate the two, Judaism and Zionism. They're one and the same. And they try to always make that point. So that in other words, if you criticize Zionism, you're criticizing the Jews, you're criticizing Judaism, you're an anti-Semite. And that's a game that they played for a long time, and they're playing it, right now. It's constantly hitting out at anybody that criticizes Zionism. And an unfortunate consequence of that, and let's say you can't blame those people, a lot of them anyway, who are saying, hey, maybe the problem is with the Jews, because these people, these Zionists like Netanyahu and all his supporters, hey, they're saying, hey, you do this, it's the Jews that you're criticizing. You say, well, if that's the case, then I'll just criticize. If that's what you guys are about, if Judaism means you got to be pro-genocide, then I'm an anti-Semite. Call me that. That's the danger. And it's just, so I think we should always applaud those people again, the Max Blumenthals and many, many others, and point out, and they do, themselves. They're, they make it clear that, again, they don't try to find any excuses for Israeli Jews in general. And they, Max Blumenthal will point out that something like 80% of them are in favor of ethnic cleansing and so on. But, just by doing that, by being so honest, we understand, that it would be terribly unjust to paint with a broad brush and say that, okay, yeah, the problem is the Jews. Okay. No, the problem is Zionism. It's largely, but not entirely, not by a long stretch, is it is simply a Jewish phenomenon. Let's not forget, Christian Zionism has a long history here that actually antedates, Jewish Zionism. It has its own independent history, and they've come sort of together, and now they feed off of each other. But they were on separate, but parallel tracks for decades, and that's something too. That's not. Those Zionists are not at all Jewish. And then we have just many secular Zionists, people like Macron and whatever, that just these powerful people that have always supported Zionism. Let's not forget them too. That's the whole thing. It's just Jewish Zionism is a part of it. It's a big part of it, but it's not all of it by a long shot. And it would just be a real unfortunate distortion of the reality if we just focused on those Zionists who happen to be Jewish.
Well, and add this, a couple of things. As you said, the people that push Zionism and Judaism are like, look in Congress. Most of the people aren't Jews. Look at a lot of the MAGA people, they're not Jews. A lot of the people that push that are not even Jewish people. Some of the most, fervent Zionists are not Jews, which again goes to show you something, that Zionism really is not, I'll put it like this. To me, it's something that uses Judaism, uses Jewish people as human shields in a way, for kind of an imperialist, kind of a colonialist mindset, because you have Israel, that the people in Europe that over the course of the last 1,000 years were the most, anti-Jewish people. They had pogroms, they killed Jews. And one could actually argue that the Holocaust, as it were, was like the crescendo of the last 1,000 years. It was like the last 1,000 years of hating Jewish people in Europe kind of maxed out right there. You know what I mean? And then those people then said, well, we got to look out for the Jewish people. We got to take the people who had done the worst to Jewish people, then said, we're going to look out for the Jewish people. Well, how are you going to do that? We're going to take all these European Jewish people and we're going to stick them in the middle of all the oil. And we're going to piss off everybody out there and steal their land and kill them and stuff like that. And then we're going to support them. And we're going to say, well, it's Europe, because they're in the Eurovision and everything Europe. So it's a European colony. I could make the argument that they built a European colony in the middle coincidentally where all the oil just happened to be, and they stuck it there. And then they've been utilizing that colony for as the leading edge of their violence in that region against others. And it's been a political, military, and intelligence tool for the same people who mistreated, abused, and pogromed Jewish people for the last 1,000 years. And that when it comes down to it, the people that are going to take it on the chin in the long run, you know what I mean, are the Jewish people once again. That's an argument that I've made.
Yeah, well, no, I can see the side. I guess I would emphasize more the maybe just the nationalist impulse. Well, you look at the roots of Zionism. It goes back to the Jewish Zionism. It goes back to the late 19th century, and it was an entirely secular but nationalist kind of phenomenon. A rather crude kind of nationalism. It was just the idea then that we have to have our own state. And we have to be a powerful people, just like, emulate the Germans have their state. We got to have our state. And, it's just, and they looked at different kinds of real estate. And I know at one point, Uganda was suggested to them, because I happen to know that because I was born there. And it was a protectorate of the British Empire when I was actually born there. But it was something that was offered to them by the British, and it was something they considered, but they didn't take it. So it's, I guess I would, the way I see it, so its roots in a kind of Jewish nationalism, which was just one particular flavor of European nationalism. And then it took off in Palestine, as we see. And, the truth be told, I mean, there were people within the European establishment that supported it, but there were quite a few that opposed it. When I know, like in not just the European establishment, but the American establishment too, there was resistance, like within the State Department, to recognizing the state of Israel. And a lot of diplomats and so forth thought that it would be a huge mistake. But of course, it went forward. But I think that after it got started, and there was, it's really undergone a transformation over the years. Initially just an entirely secular phenomenon. And there was a lot of, suspicion about it within the kind of the old establishment. But then as it grew in power, and especially after the 6-Day War, I think a lot of people kind of joined the bandwagon and became ardent supporters of it, including, the Christian Zionism, which was already there. It really took off at that point. But then you had a real transformation of how it was viewed within the Jewish community, because there was a lot of resistance to it among religious Jews. But the religious Jews began to take it up. And then I think also just among secular Europeans and Americans actually began to see, I think this is maybe where we have a similar point of view. It's just like it became a way of Israel offered you Europeans and Americans, especially white Europeans and Americans, sort of a way to be racist and colonialist, without suffering any negative social consequences. You say, I'm just concerned about the Jews. And I just remember a friend who said that he got a lot of vicarious pleasure about, from the military exploits of the Israelis, of the IDF. And I think that's just in general true, that you just see that, there's a lot of admiration. It's like, man, they just take the gloves off, and, none of this mamby-pamby stuff. They just, they just unleash their violence against these enemies and teach them a lesson. And man, couldn't we do the same thing? I think that it's become a symbol, those people that have maybe sort of violent or very chauvinistic tendencies within the West, that Israel has become a vehicle for that kind of thinking, and for that kind of person, has become a very, very unhealthy phenomenon. And you can see where it's taken us. It's Israel itself, but then it's really taking huge chunks of American and European society with it. Who are actually, I think, enthralled sorry to say, by these kind of this very, very violent and unrestrained conduct on the part of the Israeli military. Again, the positive thing is that we're seeing the reactions. You pointed out the film festival and all. I think all that is highly significant, and I think we're looking at the future there. I think we're looking at the death throes of Zionism, and let's just hope that it doesn't take us all down with it. That's the only thing I can ask for, really.
Yeah. Well, if you look at this and you say, okay, you had this so-called liberal Zionism, which you had the kind of leaders that they still did terrible things, but they kind of hid it a little bit, and they didn't come out and say, we just want to kill them all. Right. But they did terrible things, and use words like, we're going to mow the lawn. I mean, they were brutal, they were vicious, but they just kind of did it with a little bit of a wink and a nod. They at least gave some pretense that they were civilized, but they weren't really. Zionism is not a civilized. Zionism it's just not a civilized ideology. It's a very violent, brutal, warlike ideology. Okay. And then at some point, Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, I call them the knuckle draggers. You know what I mean? The John Boltons of the world, and the Bill Cristols and the Max Boots over here, the knuckle draggers. And it would be like John Bolton, becoming president, and having, Bill Crystal and the Pipes guy and Kenny Adelman and all the worst knuckle dragging neocons. So what happened was, at some point, the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs, the knuckle draggers, who just come out and say, sure, we're going to kill them all. We're going to mow them down. Let's starve them. Let's whatever. They could care less. They say it with a smile. And then they're, apocalyptic. And then, yes, and, we need to breed a red heifer or some such craziness. They're just doing mad stuff that things that but so now I would argue that the form of Zionism that is in power in Israel now, it has transformed itself or revealed itself, depending on however you want to put it, as a fascist ideology. It has become an extremely and openly fascist ideology. And to me, once you get there, the only place to go is crash. How are they going to, how do you step down from Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and these kind of guys? No, the only thing, it's like, an addict that hits rock bottom. That's kind of where they are.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's just, the old Israel was, like you said, it was vicious. It was cruel. It was in the process of dispossessing the Palestinians. It was stealing their land. It was building the greater Israel, but it was doing it gradually. And it was always concerned about its image. It always had people that could present a civilized face to the world. And occasionally, like when, something occurred, like that resulted in a lot of civilian casualties, whether it was in Lebanon or the West Bank or wherever, and if attracted the world's attention. Again, it would just be like a tenth of what happens every day now in Gaza. But back then, there seemed to be the standards were higher. There was there was a certain an effort to recognize the humanity of these people that were being oppressed. And the Israelis had to be careful. And when they overstepped, they went too fast, they killed too many people, they would actually apologize. This is the thing, we forget. That was the old Israel. Now, again, they were vicious. They were engaged in this, this project of dispossession. But they were doing it carefully. They were doing it cautiously. They were being careful not to lose their support in the U.S. But now, it's like that whole civilized demeanor, the civilized mask has fallen off. And we see on the other side, the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs. And Netanyahu himself has undergone a transformation. He used to be much more careful. That's what a lot of the, the Israelis themselves have noticed, because he's been around for a long time and he wasn't always so open about his, let's say, genocidal or intent. But he has, the mask has fallen. And I think you're right. You can't really put it back on now. I mean, it's just like, we've all seen it. We always mention Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but there are a lot of others in the government. I was just looking, I think it was oh God, the minister of Israeli heritage came out with some really shocking genocidal statement. I said, did you really say that? And I looked
Yeah,
up, yeah, sure enough. And then I saw, yeah, he makes a statement like that, a genocidal statement, like kill them all every 2 weeks. I
yeah.
mean, he's a minister in the government. And so this is just part of, everyday life. That's why you get these polls showing that, again, well over half, something like over half Israeli Jews say, yeah, kill them all, or 80% say just ethnically cleanse them all. I mean, this is where we've gone. And again, the mask has fallen, and once the mask has fallen, you can't put it back up again. We've all seen the face.
Well, the other part of it is this: you can't be a warrior nation forever. And right now, as we're talking about, there's no way for them to step down, ideologically and say, okay, we're going to calm down and go back to being a normal nation. No, they're at war, fighting in Gaza. They won a war with, they're fighting the Yemen. They're bombing them. They're Lebanon. Oh, we've got to launch a war against them soon. We're fighting in Syria. Who knows what next? The West Bank, although we got to go over there and fight. And you know what I mean? Now, internally, they only got but so many people. So what they're basically saying is all the young men and young women, you will just be in eternal war. You forget, you used to be home on Saturday night watching Netflix. You used to go to restaurants. You used to do things like that. Those days are over. We used to have a booming tourist economy. None of that. The only thing we do now as Israel is we are the leading edge of an imperial war in the Middle East. If you're an Israeli teenager, you can, when do you turn 18, 19, 21? As soon as you do, get your guns. You're going to war. The rest of you young people, the day, you thought you might want to go out and get a girlfriend and get married and have 2.5 children in a minivan. No, forget all of that stuff. You will be on the battlefield. That's all you're going to do. That's what your life is. We're Israel. And when we get finished with this war, we got to go fight them, and then we got to fight those. And all you are now is just a society of constant, permanent war. And there's no way they can ever turn that off at this point, which means internal collapse.
Yeah, no, the Israeli society is under very severe strains. It has to be said, real resistance to this perpetual war, because people are being worn down, just the way that you describe it. And there's and the IDF is struggling to bring in the reservists for the current operation that they're Gideon's chariots to against Gaza City. Terrible. I just saw they're just leveling entire neighborhoods. Just blew up in the elementary school. I think it was yesterday. And just took down a residential tower. It goes on and on and on. There is actual resistance to that. I mean, there is. I think polls show that more than like 50%, something like 63%, want it to stop now. The fighting in Gaza, at least for now, so they can bring the hostages home. Now, unfortunately, you look at that and say, maybe there's second thoughts about what they've done. It's nothing. They don't care a bit. Again, there's the 3% or something that actually does, that really is terribly upset, more than upset about what's happened in Gaza and what's been done to the Palestinians. But it's many of these same people that want to end the war, the great majority of them definitely would just, once they get the hostages home, they've had arrests, then they'll just go back to ethnically cleansing. They have I don't think they would have any qualms about that. But it is putting the society under real strain. And there's, real conflicts that are rising to the surface. The one that could bring down the government that is often brought up is the whole issue of the ultra Orthodox. I guess they call them the Haredim, who are, are big supporters of the war, but won't fight it. They, for various reasons, they don't want to be part of the IDF. And quite naturally, I can understand this. The rest of Israeli society is saying, no way, this isn't, sign these guys up. It's like, I haven't seen my kid in 2 years, or he's now suicidal or whatever, because of the stuff that you put him through and made him do. And then these guys, they can just, Yeah, they can stand on the sidelines and rah, 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 but they don't have to send anybody. Obviously, it's very, very unpopular. But the thing is, the ultra Orthodox are just an important part of Netanyahu's coalition. So he's always trying to juggle between them, and he's very wily. He's a very good juggler. But at some point, I think the balls are going to fall, and the whole thing will fall apart. And we'll see. The Israeli society itself, may not hold together.
Well, part of it is, the hubris is we can do whatever we want because we got Uncle Sam behind us. Yeah. We can do whatever we want because we'll go to the UN. Who cares? The US will veto it. Go anywhere else. Who cares? The US. You try to go up there with the ICC, the US will sanction her. We're untouchable. It's like being a made man in the mafia. Yeah. I'm a made man. Nobody will mess with me because they know I got the entire mafia that will avenge me or come threaten you or whatever. And so they've got that. What happens? And that's the other part. The bond market's looking kind of shaky. We could be looking at some 2008 kind of thing, or at least, a bad situation economically. What happens when Uncle Sam's hurt and the people in America start saying, what the hell are you doing sending money over to anywhere, Ukraine or anywhere else? We're struggling here. And it becomes internal. What happens, let's say the midterms, which is still a long ways off. But the midterms get here, and members of these parties start falling like dominoes to anti-Zionist challengers in the primaries. There's some things that could happen again in the same way that at some point reality will assert itself in some form to the Macron and Starmers and Mertzes of the world at some point. And I think we're closer than farther away. The same thing has got to happen with Zionism in Israel.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things. Well, there's the economic that you're pointing to. That's definitely part of it. But it's just also the changing perceptions of Israel in this country. And again, yeah, it's like every member of the Israeli political class understands that they are completely dependent on the U.S. And they cannot afford to lose the U.S. They lose the U.S. and it's just all over. They can't prosecute these wars. They can't hold on to these territories without the continual protection and support of the U.S. And for the first time ever, we're seeing striking majorities, that actually favor have a more favorable view of the Palestinians than they do of the Israelis. I think in one case it was I can't remember, it was maybe just the demographic was just younger people, but they actually there was a more favorable view of Hamas than there was of Israel, and those are really astounding changes, and they should put the fear of God into these, into the Zionists. And I think it has. I think some of them are really understand what's going on. And it's really the writing on the wall for them that, hey, this period of unconditional support that started in the 1960s, I think I would really point to the 6-Day War and the USS Liberty incident is kind of where it just that rock solid unconditional support began. That is coming to an end. It will come to an end. We already have a Republican member of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, call it a genocide. And we've got a couple dozen on the Democratic side that have said the same thing. So and that's only going to grow. That's going to continue to spread. It's just through every demographic. The only ones that that are really safe for the Zionists are the 60s and over, which would include me actually, but I'm not part of that. They're safe, but obviously we're on the way out, and it's that younger category that you have lost. They've already lost them. Definitely on the left, I think they're just overwhelmingly anti-Zionist, but also we see a real striking shift on the right among younger people too. They are losing the United States, but I think Netanyahu is just thinking about his own career, and he's thinking that for the next 5 years or whatever, I'm safe, and he just doesn't care. He wants to, maybe he thinks in that time he can achieve his greater Israel and his legacy as he imagines it. But it'll be, if he achieves it, I think then Israel loses the U.S. It's all over. It really is, and they will lose the U.S. They will.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. There's no question. It's not a matter of if it's just a matter of when. Well, we're just about out of time, but I did want to ask you about, before we go, the Venezuela thing going on here, where there's supposedly a boat. Some people are suspicious. Did they really? Is it an AI video? We don't know. But if they did, then there's a lot. Your thoughts on this whole Venezuela thing after Trump? I mean, I'm sure you've seen the videos where Trump said, "Oh yeah, they got lots of oil, and if it was up to me, I'd take the oil. We'd have all this oil. They're close by." And so everybody really knows what this is about, and it ain't about drug dealers.
Right. No question about it. Yeah, I agree. It's about the oil in this case. I just found the whole thing embarrassing and disgusting. I'm really ashamed of that kind of behavior. Look, if you suspect them of smuggling drugs, then you do what you always do. You follow the boat, and then when it's in U.S. waters, you board it, and if you find the drugs there, arrest the people. That's what you do, right? You don't just blow it up, without proof. You don't know who's on there. You really don't need these. The U.S. Navy to take on speedboats. What
do we pay the DEA for? Other than training killers to go execute foreign, do you remember when the prime minister of Haiti got machine gunned, and then they found out that all of the assassins were trained in Colombia by the DEA? So I guess the DEA's training assassins, but I mean, the whole story makes no sense. The whole story is pretty absurd. I'm supposed to believe that the drug dealers were like, hey, let's take a boat that probably has a cruising range of 150 miles that'll no the hell way ever make it to the U.S. from this shore. It's far too far. We'll take that and we'll run some drugs. Really, what route would you like to take, sir? Well, there's a whole armada of ships. Why don't we go right through them? I'm sure that won't be a problem. It's absurd.
Yeah. There are all kinds of it stinks to high heaven, the whole thing. Even if it turns out to be a drug smuggling boat, it's just wrong. That's an extrajudicial execution. We're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to be that kind of country, and it's shameful that we engaged in it. It's wrong. And I don't know what's planned. I saw a news item this morning that I think the Marines were practicing landings in a certain part of Florida, the Florida coast, that is supposed to be similar to the Venezuelan coast. That's just one headline that I saw. So I don't know what we have up our sleeves, but it may be, this is what I'm afraid of. It's just like Trump is frustrated. He's starting to realize he can't push around the Russians. He can't push around the Chinese. He can't push around the Indians. So he's going to find a little Latin American country and beat it up. To no end. It'll just, it'll be a disaster. But it's just like it's the behavior of a bully. That's, but not of a rational actor or of a civilized country.
Well, I'll say this: Venezuela ain't that country. You know what I mean? If he's thinking the terrain is mountainous. They've handed out guns to 4 million people who are revolutionary, ready for armed struggle. If you send 4,000 or 400,000, which we don't have, Marines into Venezuela, they're going to get chewed up. Chewed up. I mean, those people are ready. I've been there. I've been around, traveled the countryside, talked to the people. They are ready to fight. And if you send in there will be no street in no town that they can go on where they won't be under fire non-stop. Let's not forget what happened with the Bay of Piglets. A bunch of so-called mercenaries are going to come ashore. They didn't even make it in the shore. Why? Because all the fishermen had AK-47s. The fishermen were out fishing on a day-to-day basis. That AK-47s. There's some guys that come in. Bloop, 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 bloop. You ain't getting in. You're going to be engaged with the fishermen.
Right.
Before you even get on the shore, you make it to shore, the rest of the village is going to cut you to shreds. It's not an option. They deliberately handed out millions and they have 4 million armed people in their militias. You know, that's not the country that you ever want to try to invade and occupy. Not a person, not a Marine would make it out of there alive.
Yeah. No, it could be a disaster. You know, I don't know what they're thinking about, but you know, I think it would be a huge mistake to underestimate the stupidity of our regime. So we may see a disaster in Venezuela. You're right.
Sometimes, you know, as an empire's crashing, they got to do something really, really stupid before they get it. You know, like nothing gets, and they do something really, really stupid that backfires so bad. And man, that would be, or starting another war with Iran. By the time they close down the Straits of Hormuz, or don't, they just turn Israel into a moonscape. I mean, they want to do it. They couldn't fight Iran for 12 days before.
Yeah.
They really going to try that again?
Yeah. Well, I have my doubts that they're going to try again. They might, but I have my doubts about it. And it may be again. It's just like the bully is sulking and he's looking around. He's looking on the map and it says Venezuela. That's where I'm. I'm gonna beat those. And but I think he may be in for a very unpleasant surprise. I think you're right.
There's no place you can go now. People aren't scared of the bully and they're ready to fight. So at any rate, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. The name of the channel is Conversations Among the Ruins with Peter and his son Charlie. It's fantastic. They put out stuff Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and they chop some of their conversations up and put them out at other times. It's an outstanding channel. I recommend it. Everybody go there and subscribe. Thank you very much. Follow me on Rockfin and Rumble and Telegram and all that kind of stuff. If you can, thank you very much to all my Patreons. If you can afford PayPal, buy me a coffee or whatever, highly appreciated. Thank you very much. The most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. Thanks a lot. We're out.